We do have a lot to cover because Kant, I usually have 2 lectures on Kant. He is a little tricky. This time it's only 1 lecture, but like I said, there's also a couple of videos online. I'll send you a link later, which I recorded a year ago, and hopefully they will help a little bit. And hopefully you'll see how awesome Kant is. He is definitely incredible. His philosophy is very unique, gives you a very new perspective on everything. So first, as usual, we have to look back a little bit. Few things we need to remember for in order to approach Kant. One of them is, who was Copernicus and what did he do? So today you'll hopefully see also why it is important in philosophy, because you may think, okay, Copernicus sounds a little more like astronomy, but Kant is the person who mentions Copernicus, and for good reason. He compares himself to Copernicus. So what did he do? Anybody? Exactly. Heliocentric model, sun at the center, the earth revolves around the sun rather than the other way around. Okay, Louis, good job. So we'll see how that relates to Kant. What, according to Hume, is the basis of our causal judgments? Remember, Hume actually triggered Kant's response. At least that's how Kant himself explains it. He says that he was awakened from dogmatic slumber by Hume. So what was Hume saying about the causal judgments? What did he say is missing in our, how should I put it, the way we actually experience causality? So when we say this thing causes that thing, we do observe 3 things. We actually observe them, right? This comes from experience. So what are these 3 things we always see? Well, one of them, very obviously, that this thing precedes the other thing, right? This is how we actually say it causes it. If it doesn't precede it, if it happens after, then we can't say that it somehow caused it. In time, they have to have this type of priority. Cause, then effect, not the other way around. It's kind of a little bit hard to say whether there are cases when they happen simultaneously, but even if they seem to happen simultaneously, if you split it up to fraction of a second, you'll probably still find that one of them causes the other. So one of them precedes the other. Okay, what other 2 things do we actually experience, other than the fact that they precede each other? Yes, they should be somehow touching each other or in other ways connected to each other. That again seems a little tricky, because sometimes you can have some sort of electromagnetic waves or whatever. Can you really say they are touching each other? I guess at the time of Hume it wasn't really much of an issue. We today may kind of wonder about that. Nonetheless, there is some sort of material interaction. This electromagnetic wave does hit in some way the other receiver in order to cause something. Priority in time, I already said that, right? That's what I just described. So priority in time, contiguity in space. What's the third one? Constant conjunction, exactly. So, in other words, let's say one thing happens, then the other thing happens. And in another case, one thing happened, but the other thing does not happen. So you cannot really say there's causality. In fact, if you take statistics, and especially in econometrics, when they try to figure out what is the cause, that's the biggest thing, because sometimes 2 events may not be causally related. They may be related in some other way. How do you figure out whether there is causation? Well, the best way to see is they have to be constantly conjunct. So when one happens, the other always happens. An example with the vaccinations now, right? People vaccinate. You have first small sample, 100 people. You vaccinated them just to test. They all okay. Then you vaccinate 40,000 people. Suppose somebody died. Now, did vaccine cause them to die? How do you know? You have to figure out Are there other deaths? If there's no other deaths, then perhaps it didn't. Perhaps it's a coincidence, because if you did 40,000 people and only one of them died, that could be a pure coincidence. Now, suppose that person has certain disease X. Okay, you can look at the other people whether they also have this disease. Let's say nobody has this disease except for this one person. So then there may be causality related to this disease. So if you vaccinate a person with this disease and this person dies, that means the vaccination in case of this disease is deadly. But how do you figure it out? Well, if you broaden it, if you vaccinate 1 million people and you have, let's say, 10 people with this disease and all of them die, naturally you have now a strong case for causality. You're saying, look, 10 people out of 1 million had this rare disease, all 10 of them died after they've been vaccinated. Naturally there is a close connection. Suppose that didn't happen. Suppose you have 10 people who have this rare disease, one of them again died, the others didn't die. What does that mean? That means there's no causality again. It means a coincidence. So naturally when they vaccinate a lot of people, people die. People die all the time for a variety of reasons. In fact, if you take 1 million random people, every day about 30 of them will die. That's just, natural fact of life, because we have this cycle of life. People live 80 years. On each day, a certain number of people dies. So whether or not there's any connection with the vaccine can only be established if you find this constant conjunction of some sort. If you don't find the constant conjunction, we say there's no causation, it's a coincidence. Yes, somebody got vaccinated and died. Somebody else had a tasty meal and died. Somebody went to the cinema and died. That does not mean that the tasty meal killed him, doesn't mean that the cinema killed him. And it doesn't mean that vaccination killed him. It just means that it happened by pure coincidence. Okay, well, it's kind of a relevant topic now, so I went a little bit too far into that, but this is the point. What, however, is one thing he says is missing in our experience when we say something causes the other thing? He's saying these three things we observe, there's one thing we don't. Necessary connection is missing. Exactly. So, in other words, we can never be completely sure. We can only look and say, okay, every single time this thing happened, then that thing happened, must be cause in it. What we cannot say is that happens through some sort of strict necessity, logical necessity. The type of necessity which is like 2 plus 2 equal 4 type of necessity, right? 2 plus 2 equal 4 necessarily. There's absolutely no way, nowhere, under no circumstances that it's going to end up 3 or 5 or 10 or 15. It will always be 4, because 2 plus 2 equal 4. So that type of necessity is missing in our experience. We never experience things with this type of necessity. We add it. How do we add it? Well, we see it happening every time. Every time I drop the pen, it falls down. Every time I do something, jump, I always go back down. That means there is necessarily some sort of gravity, but this is not the same type of necessity. This is more of a probability type thing. We make it up. This is what Hume said. He said we can never be completely sure. What do we really base our causal judgments on instead then? What's the answer to this according to Hume? Habit. Exactly. Good job again, Louis. Habit. We're saying habit. We see it all the time, so we just assume it will be always that way. And it, more often than not, it works. And if sometimes it doesn't, then we are surprised. We go, whoa, how is it possible? It was always like that. But note that even though we are surprised, we are not like, it's not like 2 plus 2 equal 5 kind of surprise. It's not like, oh my god, the world is like no more. I must be insane. No, it's just, but this is so weird and unusual. Nonetheless, it's not impossible. Now, one more thing about Hume's view on substances. In particular, actually, let's remember his view about spiritual substance. What did he say? Are you sure you're not confusing him with Berkeley? Yes, probably. So Berkeley said there is no material substance, there is spiritual substance. You remember, Hume actually said no, there is no substance of any kind. There simply is no substance. There is no material substance, no spiritual substance. At least as far as we know. We really can't say there is such thing as even myself. Remember what he was saying myself is? It's just a flow of perceptions. A flow of perceptions. Where is me? There's no me. There's flow of perceptions which is constantly changing. Now these are some of the things which actually triggered Kant's reaction. Okay, so now we can talk about Kant. He was born in Königsberg, East Prussia. The book actually mentions that it is former USSR. Well, it is true it's former USSR. It also is current Russia. I don't know why they didn't say that. But yes, it is part of Russia. How did it become part of Russia? As a result of World War II. This was part of Germany, East Prussia, which was very close to Russia, and this is where usually the attacks on Russia happened during number of wars, First World War, Second World War. So as a result of the conferences between the Allies, it was agreed that this part, instead of being part of Germany, became part of Russia. Anyway, that's a little bit off the subject, but nonetheless, if today you will be looking for it on the map, you will see a city of Kaliningrad in Russia rather than Königsberg in Germany. But nonetheless, it's the same city where Kant was born and where he spent his entire life. He was born April 22nd, 1724. Oh, it's his birthday soon. Lived for almost 80 years, died 1804. And again, as book correctly mentions, he never left his hometown his entire life. Didn't have a very exciting life. Was not married, didn't have a family, didn't do anything but philosophy. Lived his entire life in Königsberg, never traveled more than, I believe, 60 miles from his place of birth. Not a very exciting life, but a very powerful mind. He got education from University of Königsberg, then he became professor at the University of Königsberg, and then he became a legend at the University of Königsberg. This is more or less the story of his life. So without spending too much time about his personal details, let's get into his work. So, Critique of Pure Reason, the notoriously difficult book, his first book. What were his goals? Well, you hopefully already got an idea what the problem was in philosophy at that time. One problem was the divide between what we today call empiricism and rationalism. Empiricists, again, were believing that everything comes from experience. We are born as a clean slate. Rationalists believed that no, actually we have these pre-installed ideas in our mind. Who's right? Who's wrong? Kant was trying to put it together and reconcile it, and he actually more or less did. The second thing, the problem between religion and science. Again, a very current problem. All philosophers were trying to deal with it. In particular, human freedom. Science tells us everything follows the laws of science. But, if that is true, how can human beings have free will? How can they be free to decide to do this rather than that? Shouldn't it be determined by some sort of, chemical balance in your head? But if that is the case, then you really can't blame anybody for anything. A murderer commits the murder. You tell him, why did you do that? He tells you, well, chemical imbalance in my head. What can I do? Laws of, physics. There's nothing I can do about that. And then, if you go down that path, you have to agree. You have to say, okay, well, sorry then, man. It really is bad that you did that, but there's nothing we can do now, right? So let's just move on. Seems wrong. Seems something very wrong about this approach, right? We as human beings do not do that. We actually say, we blame the person. We're saying, you committed the murder. You're guilty. you didn't have to commit it, you had choice. But that goes in contradiction with the science. So again, this is where Kant was trying to address this problem. And finally, the whole crisis of metaphysics. Remember, metaphysics is this question of what is ultimately real, reality. Well, because of all these different ideas coming from different philosophers, again, metaphysics was getting into a very tough spot. More and more people were just rejecting it. Hume in particular was saying that the books on metaphysics should be burned if they do not give you any knowledge of practical life, that they are completely useless. So again, Kant did kind of have problem with that, because as you will see, he believed that some of these metaphysical ideas, such as idea of God, is still necessary for us. So how did he try to resolve it? Few things there. Well, one of them is dogmatism. He does talk, a book mentions dogmatism. He says he was a dogmatist himself before. What does that mean? According to Kant, dogmatism is the presumption of getting on solely with pure cognition from philosophical concepts according to principles which reason has been using for a long time without first inquiring in what way and by what right it has obtained them. So, where do all these ideas come from? What is the foundation for these ideas? How does our mind actually work them out? This is what Kant wanted to find out, because we take it for granted, he says, rather than try to figure out the sources of these ideas. So dogmatic procedure would be without an antecedent critique of reason's capacity to just make this kind of wild, unreasonable speculations. To give you an example, let's say when Berkeley says that God actually gives us these ideas of the world, right? Okay, well, that, I guess, is a possible explanation, but what exactly is the foundation for that? Is there some sort of evidence for that? Do we have some sort of good reason to suggest that this is the case, rather than, let's say, that maybe there's no God? And Hume was saying, no, we don't. And Kant actually kind of agrees with that and says, unless you figure out how exactly our mind works, unless you figure out the laws which actually are behind all that, you cannot make this kind of generalizations. So that's what he calls dogmatism, just basically coming up with a theory without critically questioning that theory. He calls his own philosophy critical philosophy, which is why the first work is called Critique of Pure Reason. So this is a critical approach. Question how does the mind actually come up with this stuff, where it's coming from, what is going on. To look at the work of a human mind from kind of an outside. Try to literally come out of your head and observe how it works from a side. It's very difficult, which is one of the reasons his work is so difficult. We will get mainly the results. We'll talk about the results which he reaches. Critique itself actually tries to figure out the process, and that's what makes it so difficult, because if you ever try to read it, you will see that it's very, very complex, and we're not going to go into all the details, just a few of them. He actually had two editions of it. First edition was 1781. After he had this edition, he was a little bit misunderstood. A lot of people thought, well, what's then the difference between his philosophy and Berkeley? Because there seemed to be, but his transcendental idealism is still type of an idealism. How it's different from Berkeley, we will see, but Kant himself was offended. He thought this is totally misunderstanding of his philosophy, so he rewrote large portions of this work in the second edition, 1781, and today, if you buy his work, it actually has portions from both. They called A and B versions. Why? Because the some parts are so different that to understand him, it's best to read both of them. That's one of the reasons why we still need both of them to try to figure out what's going on. Okay, so he calls his philosophy Copernican revolution. I do kind of need to use the board to explain this part a little bit better. So let's go to the board. What exactly is the Copernican turn there? Now let's first of all look at the problem. So the problem he is addressing is again the same one. We have a particular object, whatever it is. Here's what we may say our mind. This is our mind, this is the object. Now, how do we know the object is there? Remember that for Locke, representative realism, he said we don't have access to the object, we have an access to certain idea or picture of an object in our head based on what we receive from an object. So this is the more or less traditional way we look at it. The object is here, certain visual feed, certain sensual feed goes into our senses, eyes, nose, mouth, and so on. We can taste it maybe, we can smell it. And so there is some sort of an object in our mind, and that's how it works. How did Kant turn it around? He said, why don't we, instead of putting an emphasis here on an object, put an emphasis here on our mind and twist it around and understand that it's, and this is kind of the important difference with Berkeley, it's a two-way street. Now, he calls it the Copernican turn, but that in itself may be a little bit deceptive, because he does not just put an emphasis on the mind, he switches both of them and he says both of them take part. So this is how he thinks it works. There are objects out there and there's certain feed coming from these objects. But our mind also contributes something to understanding of the world. So in other words, it's like a mental software. We need to run it in order to understand the world. There are in particular two things which he calls pure intuition, which he says is what our mind adds to the world, and this is time and space. In other words, time and space are not real. They are part of your mind. In order to understand objects, your mind has to contribute time and space dimension. Your mind understands itself in time. Your mind understands the outside world in space. So everything you perceive, you have to perceive in space. It's like mental software. That's the only way you can do it. Everything inside your mind, the process of understanding what is going on, is in time. Again, it's a necessity. But neither of them are real. What is this real world like if our mind is not going to contribute something? Well, this is what he calls the thing in itself. So this would be the thing in itself. What is the thing in itself? It is the thing the way it would be if we could access it without our mind contributing anything. So note that what he's saying is, these objects there, they are real, all right. They are not just ideas. However, when our mind perceives them, our mind distorts them in a sense. It contributes something. It's like some sort of glasses. Suppose you have no glasses, you don't see anything. You're like, what's I can't see anything. So this is like when you don't have mind. But your mind puts on these glasses, and then it can see everything. However, it no longer can see it the way it truly is. Now it kind of distorted it in some way. Distorted is probably the wrong word here, because Kant himself never uses it, but for the purposes of understanding, it is useful. So think about it at least in this way. We kind of see the world warped in a sense. Warped by our understanding, in particular time and space. This is what is kind of distorting it. So the way things are in themselves, They are not in time and they are not in space. You may wonder like, whoa, wait a minute, how can we? Yes, we cannot even imagine that. We cannot imagine an object which is not in time and not in space. However, at least theoretically, you understand the possibility of that, right? Even though you cannot imagine this marker without any dimensions and outside of time, but suppose that there is something out there which is outside of time and outside of space, and that would be that marker the way it is in itself. Okay. Now let's go back to the slides. So hopefully that part we are done with. There's a lot of interesting stuff which immediately comes out of this explanation. So this is what he calls his Copernican revolution. Trying to turn the tables on an object. Trying to understand that the object has to conform to our cognition itself. This is his way also to avoid Hume's skepticism. He will give his answers regarding causality, self, and several other important concepts based on this schema, based on this explanation of reality. Okay. Now, this is kind of slightly of a technical part, which is a little bit difficult to understand, but it's kind of necessary to understand how does he criticize Hume. Book doesn't go there, but let's see if we can actually understand. So he's saying there are two varieties of judgments. Okay, let me go back here and explain it this way. Two ways we know the reality. Remember, this is something we already kind of talked about. We can know reality a posteriori. A posteriori, what does it mean? Do you remember a posteriori? Based on experience. Posterior to experience. Okay, and a priori. A priori would be prior to experience. So remember that rationalists were saying that we know things prior to experience. Why? Because they're pre-installed in our mind, certain ideas are already there, and they were given variety of examples of that. Now, empiricists were saying, no, we actually know everything from experience. Now, Kant says, well, it's kind of partially true in both cases. And this is how it's true. There's also two types of judgments we can make. Some of them are analytical judgments. And some of them are synthetic. So let's look at the example of a posteriori experience, which is synthetic in nature. All students in this class are at least 5 feet tall. Why is it a posteriori? Well, because you cannot figure it out without actually looking at the students, right? You need experience to do that. Why is it synthetic judgment? Because it actually adds something to what we know. It's not included in a concept of student in this class that this student is only 5 feet tall, more than 5 feet tall. Now, a priori analytic. All bachelors are unmarried. Why is it a priori? Well, you don't have to look at bachelors to know that they are unmarried. How do you know that? It's inside the concept. The concept of a bachelor immediately tells you that you are or somebody is unmarried, right? So that's why it is analytic. Analytic basically means you can get into the concept and figure it out from the concept itself. You don't put things together, don't synthesize things, such as a student of this class, a person of more than 5 feet tall, which are two different things. You have to put them together for this type of judgment. But bachelor and unmarried, you really don't have to put them together. They're already kind of there. So this is the two types of judgments and the two types of knowledge we have. Okay, fair enough. So most of a posteriori are synthetic, most of a priori are analytic. this is how it works in this world. Now, is there analytic a posteriori? No, there isn't. It's impossible. A posteriori is from experience. It cannot be analytic. However, Kant says, there are such judgments that are a priori synthetic. They are kind of a mix of both. What would be an example of a priori synthetic judgment? According to Kant, judgment 2 plus 2 equal 4 is a priori synthetic. What does that mean? It means that, first of all, you can do it completely in your head. You do not have to look at anything. So it is a priori. But it is synthetic in the sense that it actually adds something to your knowledge of the outside world. You might wonder, how is that adding anything? Well, if you expand it, like, okay, this is immediately clear to you that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Suppose it is a long mathematical calculation. Don't you see how it works? You making this long calculation, you're actually learning something, but you're doing the entire thing in your head. It actually does not come from any experience whatsoever. So this is the type of judgment which we can actually use to know the world. How is it important for our purposes? Well, let's take a look. Hopefully it wasn't too obscure, because, like I said, that part may be a little difficult, but hopefully you guys understand now. So this is the examples again. Analytic judgments, all bachelors are unmarried. Why is it analytic? The concept of bachelor, if you analyze this concept, you know he is unmarried. You don't have to look at the outside world. And he calls it, it's actually a good way to put it, judgments of clarification. Why are they clarification? Because they just clarify what this concept means. They do not actually add anything to your knowledge. Synthetic judgments, on the other hand, something like all bachelors in this class are at least, well, in this case, 6 feet tall, would be a judgment of amplification. It amplifies your knowledge. It gives you something more. But for the most part, they only come from experience, a posteriori. So what Hume did not understand, Kant is saying, is that there's actually this third type. And not all judgments are analytic a priori, and not all of them are synthetic a posteriori. This is not the only two kinds. You also can have synthetic a priori judgments. Mathematics is a good example. Another great example of synthetic a priori judgment is all events have a cause. Causality. This is how we know one thing causes the other. It's not just that we constantly observe that happening, but our mind does an additional work of understanding this, which goes outside of experience. So it's not based on just experience, but is done by our reason. Our reason has this additional capacity to understand certain things which we cannot clearly see from experience. So in other words, we can do some work in our head which creates new concepts, and these new concepts actually help us to do better in life. So the synthetic a priori judgments are the judgments which are purely based on our mind, purely based on our ideas. Nonetheless, they are necessary judgments. They are not just one thing constantly follows the other type of judgments. Mathematics, the entire field of mathematics, he's saying, is like this. And if you look at some complicated calculation, let's say 500 to 25 times 781 equal to blah blah blah, you notice that this is not something you can immediately understand. Your mind has to do certain work. But after your mind does this certain work and you get the result here, that result expands your knowledge of reality beyond reality itself. It actually gives you some new additional information. Okay, so Kant is asking now, how are these types of judgments possible? How come we can actually even make them? How are they possible in mathematics? How are they possible in physics? More importantly, how are they possible in metaphysics and morality? Can we actually find some type of necessity in metaphysics and morality which is not based on experience only, which we can figure out purely by working it inside our head? And he calls it his transcendental method. What does it mean? It means looking on experience from outside and trying to figure out what are the rules, what is going on, how do we actually do things. So transcendental just essentially means not from inside the process, but more of a from outside of the process, what are these necessary conditions which make the process possible. And like I said already, he figured out based on that space and time are not real, but they are contributed by our mind as forms of intuition. Form of outer sense would be space, and form of inner sense is time. He explains in his work why he thinks that. Again, it has been disputed by some other philosophers, but many philosophers agree with him, and it certainly is a very interesting way to look at it. So, in other words, he's saying, he makes the distinction. He's saying, well, is it then true that they are not real? He's saying, well, they are empirically real, but they are transcendentally ideal. So, as far as our experience goes, space and times are real, because the only way we can have any experience is through space and time. But as far as like grander reality, you may say God's point of view reality exists, space and time are not real. Okay. How about substance and causality? Remember, those are the other two things people were also arguing about. So just like space and time, he's saying they are not transcendentally real, they are just parts of our, you may say, mental software. This is something which is necessary for us to operate. In order for us to understand the world, we have to see it as causally connected. We have to see that one thing causes the other thing. Now that doesn't mean that the world in itself is like that. It just means that we, as human beings, cannot understand the world in any other way. Similarly with substance, we actually have to contribute this idea of a substance. It's, you may say, created by our mind in order to understand the world. So again, this is something our mind adds. So note that when we look back here at this picture, this is what is going on. There is indeed some sensual feed coming from the world in this direction. But in order for our mind to process it, we do contribute, and stuff like causality, substance, all these concepts, also something our mind actually puts there in order to understand them. That's pretty much the only way we can do it. To understand it a little bit easier, like we know, for example, that there's ultrasound, right? And you know bats actually can hear it, but human beings cannot hear it. So how can bat hear it and human beings cannot? Because they have this extra capacity. So they actually have some additional capacity to contribute in order to sense it. We don't. Now suppose that there are more than 3 dimensions. This is basically one of these ideas. So we know in mathematics, right, there is 3 dimensions of space. You can see it around you. And we typically draw them like this. This would be x, y, and this would be z. Lovely. Now suppose there's one more dimension. Let's call it, I don't know, h. Note that I can't even draw it, because if I do it like this, it looks like it's also z. Why? Well, we can't even imagine the one more dimension. But suppose it's there. We just can't sense it. So this marker, maybe other than having these 3 dimensions of space, has 4th or 5th or 6th dimension too. It's there. It's just that my eyesight and your eyesight cannot see that. So that would be the way thing in itself is, the marker in itself. So that is some of these amazing Kantian ideas which he has again been building on with his philosophy. So objects conform to the mind. Object has to fit this mental software which we have in order for us to perceive it. Causality, again, that's just how our mind sees objects. Doesn't mean they are causally connected in some sort of transcendental reality, but they are causally connected in empirical reality, in reality which we perceive. And that actually answers Hume's skepticism. When Hume says we cannot have a priori knowledge because all we have is a flow of unconnected impressions, Kant is saying, well, these impressions, they do indeed come in these groups, like the marker. Note that this is visually, I have a certain and you have a certain object, one object, and if you sense it, that's also, and like this whole cluster of experience, they do go to us in this group, and empirically this is absolutely real, because that's the only way you can say something is real. Talking about it being real in any other sense is really just an empty word. So Kant makes a lot of emphasis on the fact that when he talks about thing in itself, he actually is not really talking about anything. It is more of a mental exercise. We can't know thing in itself. It's impossible. But we can talk about it. Because sometimes our mind can actually create this type of subjects which we do not sense and do not have any access to. So phenomena and noumena, that's basically these 2 worlds. He's saying this world, the world as we know it, the world of thing as we perceive it, is phenomenal world. Phenomenal. But the world as it is in itself, this side, is nominal world. Noumena, again, is mind. So it's kind of a mental world in a sense, but not the world we see as phenomena, as experience, the world of experience. And then his philosophy actually goes into a more interesting part and says that all this stuff, including the concept of God, the concept of self, and the concept of cosmos, they are here. Self as, remember that I, that what he calls transcendental ego, myself, which I kind of feel behind all these experiences, but I can never catch it. Why can't I ever catch it? Well, this is why. Because the only thing I can catch, the world of experience, has to obey time, space, causality, and substance laws. But the real me is not in space, is not in time, not causally connected, and it's not substance. What is it? Who knows? But this is where the freedom is. In this world, in phenomenal world, everything is causally connected. In this world, it's not. In this world, everything follows the laws of physics. In this world, it's not. We can only feel it sometimes, on some level, but we can never really know it, because the way our mind is built, it's built to do this side. So it's kind of a little bit of both. Everything is absolutely real. So you can hopefully see how he was confused with Berkeley, because some people are saying, what's the difference then? It seems like this real world is not fully real. He's saying, well, it is empirically real. It is true that there are all these objects, and we perceive them, and they really are there. But it's not exactly the way we see it. What we see is, again, slightly distorted by our mind. So noumena is this completely unknowable thing in itself that are not structured by the mind's categories. They are not in space, they are not in time, they are not in any of these other categories which our mind uses. Okay, transcendent illusions of metaphysics. Note the word is not transcendental, it's transcendent. So he talks about the God, self, and cosmos as partly an illusion and only partly as real. Why does he say they are illusions? Well, because we can't really know them. But every time we start talking about them, we use in our experience from the phenomenal world, but this is not how you would understand them. And this is what creates problems. Starting from the self, because when you start looking for yourself, you inevitably find what Descartes found, and which is empirical self. Empirical self is the self which indeed is nothing but the flow of your senses, the perceptual feed. But he's saying there may be this real self, transcendental self behind it. And we can actually pose it there because it's one of the necessary conditions of experience. In order for you to experience something, there has to be something there to experience all that stuff. And that is you. So when the visual feed, the sensual feed, the hearing interact in that particular point of your mind, it's not enough for all of that to come together. There should still be somebody, let's draw him as a tiny little human being, who is like actually looking at all that and listening to all that. And that is the real you. But you can't know that real you. Even you don't know that real you, because that real you is not a part of that phenomenal world. It's part of this transcendental world, the noumenal world. And similarly with cosmos as a whole. In fact, he talks about what he says antinomies of reason. What are the antinomies? This is two contradictory statements. And he says the fact that we have them and the fact that they make sense for us actually proves my point. Let's look at his antinomies. So the first antinomy is whether or not the world has a beginning in time. And he's saying, well, note that for us, if you try to use your mind, there are two contradictory statements, both of them make perfect sense. One statement is the world has beginning in time, and it is limited in space. Why does it make sense? Well, think about it. I mean, how can something not have a beginning in time? Can you imagine something which does not have a beginning in time? How can something not be limited in space? Doesn't make any sense. So you can actually argue very well that the world has beginning in time and it is limited in space. But in the same time, we can equally well argue that the world has no beginning in time and it's infinite. Why? Well, because again, how the hell can have it? How can it have beginning in time? What does that even mean? Say Big Bang. Well, why did it happen? What was before that? Absolutely nothing? Then how the hell could it possibly happen? What does it mean to say the world is limited? What is there like boundary? And then what? You get there, you hit it, and then you bounce back? Doesn't make any sense either. So both of them equally make and do not make sense. The second couple is everything can be analyzed into basic elements. So there are atoms, there are smallest particle, and nothing can be analyzed in the basic elements. Again, both of them make perfect sense. Think about it. For one thing, there should be some basic elements. There should be some sort of atoms or strings or something there. We already talked about it. It doesn't seem to make sense that there's absolutely nothing there. But, again, just like we already talked about, every time you start imagining it, suppose there is a smallest particle, the question inevitably comes, how come you can't split it in half? What happens if you split it in half? Does it have any kind of a size? If it has size, it must be at least theoretically splittable. There must be something smaller than that. So then nothing can be analyzed into these basic elements. The third pair is some events are free and undetermined, which again is the problem of freedom. We do kind of know that, it seems, because I know that right now I can either stop this lecture and say it's over, or continue it, and it really is up to me. I mean, I have good reason to continue it, but I could, if I wanted to stop it. Nothing can prevent me, right? So I do feel free, and you guys probably also feel free to like get up and stop this lecture anytime you want. But in the same time, it seems like there are laws of causality. There's these physical laws, and that means there's no freedom. So freedom and no freedom seem to be contradictory statements, and yet both of them make sense. And finally, God. There must be a necessary being in the universe. We already had arguments for that. It seems logical. It seems like something which it's reasonable to agree to. And in the same time, there are counter-arguments that how could there be? There is no necessary being. There is no God. So again, these two are equally kind of sensible, and we can make arguments for both of them. So what does it mean? Well, according to Kant, that means the following. It means our mind hits its boundary. It means we are trying to answer questions for which our mind is not made. It's not created to answer this kind of question. These questions go outside of our operating capacity. It's like taking Windows 98 computers and trying to load some sort of recent software on it. And then what would you get? The error message, right? This is the error message. It tells you you are trying to do something for which your mind is not made. You are trying to find answer to the questions for which answer cannot be given. So can we actually answer them? Well, he actually suggests the following answers. For 1 and 2, he's saying, well, in reality, it's just both false. So again, what are the first two? The world has beginning and time. The world has no beginning and time. He's saying, we are trying to, in this case, talk about the world as this kind of one thing. But the world is not one thing. The way the world itself is cannot be either limited or unlimited. It cannot be either in time or outside of time. Why? Because the world in itself has neither space nor time. So that's why it is false. Similarly with the basic elements. Again, you are trying to figure out whether objects are made of basic elements, basically trying to introduce this idea of space into something which does not have an idea of space. Idea of space is what your mind contributes. How about the next two? The next two, you say, are actually both true. Yes, we have freedom, and we don't have freedom. Yes, there is God, and yes, there is no God. How is it possible? Well, let's go back to this. There is God here in nominal world. There is no God here in phenomenal world. So both of them are true. There's freedom here in nominal world. There's no freedom here in phenomenal world. So they are both true. So in this case, both of them are true. Yes, we are free, and not we are not free. We are not free as physical objects, because every physical object has to follow the laws of physics. We are free as this true self, the transcendental self, which is outside space and outside time, and for this reason, that transcendental self is not following the laws of physics. It doesn't follow the law of causality. The law of causality does not apply to that self. Okay. Now, let's see what else we have here. So now we are getting towards his morality. He's saying idea of God and freedom are absolutely necessary for us in order to be moral beings. This is how it works. You cannot have morality if you don't believe in freedom of the will and do not believe in God. Why? Because Freedom of the will tells you actually are capable of doing good and doing wrong. And God tells you, the idea of God tells you there are good and evil. There are doing right and wrong. Now, this type of ideas, he says, are not provable. You cannot prove what God actually exists. He goes over all these arguments we went over before, and just like Hume, he rejects all of them. Ontological, cosmological, all these arguments we saw before, he rejects all of them. However, he says that even though for all intents and purposes the ideas of God, self, and cosmos are illusions, but he calls them irresistible illusions, and in fact he says they have a role. They are like regulative concepts. Regulative in a sense that they are giving our life meaning. We kind of need them. And in fact, he says we can actually reach them. And it works kind of in this way, like convergent lines. We observe certain things in life, right? Let's say this is the 3 lines. And then there's this boundary which we cannot penetrate. But if you think about it and imagine these lines continue behind this boundary, they will converge, right, in this spot. So this is how we can actually figure out that there is God, there is this self, myself, yourself, and there is some sort of a cosmos, some sort of a world. Even though we cannot know it, but we can, again, just kind of project it and say, well, based on the experience, we can well enough understand that there has to be behind this boundary which we cannot penetrate something like my true self. There has to be something like God, and there has to be something like cosmos, something like real world, whatever it is. So in ethics, he also is kind of trying to do this type of Copernican revolution, and again, he completely disagrees with Hume. Remember, Hume said we cannot use our reason in ethics. It all comes from feeling. Now Kant says no. Actually, it's the other way around. He rejects feeling and he says you can and should use your reason in ethics, in morality. And you absolutely can do it, and in fact there is a great way he suggests. Now he says the only truly good thing we can call in this world is the goodwill, if you have goodwill. Nothing in this world can possibly be conceived which could be called good without qualification except goodwill. So if you have goodwill towards others, towards whatever you want to do in life, that is what essentially is moral. You have moral duty. You have freedom to follow it or not to follow it. How can you figure it out based on reason itself? Well, this is when we get to his categorical imperative. So first of all, he's saying you should be doing good things out of duty. This is very important to him. He is making several important examples. Let's say Heidi, whoever she is walking and she recognizes that there's a child drowning. Now, note the difference between Heidi thinking it is my moral duty to save this child and Heidi thinking, well, what would be the result of me jumping into the water and saving this child? In the first case, Heidi will do it no matter what. In the second case, Heidi may start thinking like, I am not really a great swimmer. Why would I even jump into the water if I'm not sure that I will save that child? Perhaps I shouldn't do it. So according to Kant, second approach is wrong. Only first approach is important. And you should not even judge it by the consequence. So if Heidi jumps into the water and unable to save this child, Kant would say she still did her moral duty. It still is a good action. But suppose Heidi actually jumps into the water and saves the child, but for all the wrong reasons. She's running for the mayor. So instead of saving that child, her goal is to have promotion. Then she actually not being moral according to Kant. Because even though the consequence, the result is good, she saved the child, but her intention was misdirected. She didn't do it for a right reason. So this is more specifically how he frames his moral theory. Yeah, so the imperative he is talking about, again, is the command. How do you figure out how you should behave in your life? How should we all behave? He's saying, well, there's two types of imperatives. One of them is hypothetical. Hypothetical imperative is just like if you take Philosophy 102, we did talk about these hypothetical statements. If X, then Y. So if you want to get the result X, do Y. That would be the hypothetical approach. Now you can approach anything like that. So, for example, you can say, if you want to poison your neighbor, use the strong poison. Note that this is completely morally unacceptable. Nonetheless, it just gives you an instruction how to do something if you want to reach the result. So that would be the hypothetical imperative. He's saying there is a different type of imperative, which is a categorical imperative. Now that one doesn't say if this then that. It just says do that. Do that. How can you figure out what you should do? Well, ask yourself the following question. Would you want that to be a universal law? Would you want everybody else, every other human being, to do that? If the answer is yes, then that's your imperative. You should do it. If the answer is no, you should not do it. So this is kind of a rather simple way to test. Note that it's based strictly on reason. You can yourself, just as book, by the way, suggests, test it. Like, let's look at it together. Let's imagine the following behaviors and approach them with this test. Charging things on credit without being sure you can pay for them on time. Should you do it or not? Let's use the categorical imperative. So what should we ask? So in other words, you want to buy something, but you're not sure you'll pay for it. So you charge it on credit card, just, maybe I won't be able to pay for it. So what? My credit score will go down, blah, blah, whatever. I want it so badly. I don't care. So the question is, should you actually buy something but you cannot afford if you buying it on credit because you're thinking that perhaps you will not have to pay it after all, you will just ruin your credit? No, so the answer is no. Why is the answer no? Because if you, again, using this categorical imperative, you are imagining, suppose everybody is doing that. Would you want everybody to do that? What will happen if everybody does that? Just that? Just bad credit scores? Don't you think the economy would suffer quite a bit? I mean, after all, this stuff has to be paid for. Somebody is getting, their job is to, for example, make computers. If the computers have been taken without being paid for, how do you think they will continue getting their salary? Where would their salary come from? Wouldn't they lose their job? Well, what's the emergency fund? What exactly is that? If people are taking stuff and not paying for it, there's no emergency fund. Then that will be pretty bad. I mean, note that we actually have this problem now with the economy when a lot of people are laid off. But not everybody is laid off, right? A lot of people are still working. They're still producing goods. If they stopped, we would be in total mess. How would you would go to a grocery store, there's nothing there. Because where would it come from? Somebody has to at least pick it from the garden or something and bring it there. So you need truck drivers, you need farm workers. If all these workers stop working, that's it, you starve. How about electricity? Where does this come from? You need workers on the, all sorts of jobs related to electricity production, the electric stations and whatnot. So people are still working, they're still doing something. But they still have to be paid for it, right? If they are not paid for it and nobody's paid for it, the economy will stop. Nobody's going to be working if they don't get paid. Yeah, so that's why. Of course, if you are the only one who doesn't pay for it, the economy is not going to collapse. You are one little human being. But if you look at it from Kantian point of view, he's saying, hey, Not so easy. You should ask yourself, do I want everybody to act like me? And if I don't, then don't do it. Let's look at another one. This is kind of more related to our college experience. Enrolling in 2 different high-demand courses so that you can check them both out and drop the one you don't like. Would that be a good idea? If you use this kind of a approach. No, not money-wise, but not. But the question is, you know that some high-demand courses is hard to enroll into, right? So you suppose you have your turn to enroll very early on, before other students, because it's all alphabetical, right? So your last name, and then you enroll in a whole bunch of them, and you know you can't take like 5 or 6 of them. You only will take 2, but just in case you enroll into all of them at once, because you can. Right? And then you will drop them, but you will drop them last moment, before the deadline for payment, which is what? The end of first week of classes. What will happen if people do that, if everybody does that? No, instructors don't care. I mean, the enrollment, no. That I'm getting paid based on, the contract with the administration. Like, that has no effect whatsoever, especially if the college has good enrollment. That doesn't, of course, had good enrollment. It doesn't affect the pay. The problem would be for you guys, because you won't be able to enroll. If your letter is not the first one in the alphabet, but let's say the last one, you will discover that all these courses are taken. So then you might get into the waiting line, but note that if you're in a waiting line, there's no guarantee you'll be in class. And it may so happen that you will not be in class. That's what the problem will be. It is actually already a problem. I know for students it's a problem. Every single time, at least when courses were on ground, I had students come and say, I'm on waiting list, can I be in class? Because, I hope to get in, but I don't know if I will get in. And by the way, administration tells us you can't allow students in class in these situations unless they are enrolled. Well, right now it's not really a problem, but that's how it is in normal life. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't care, right? If there's empty seat, you may, of course, sit down. But as far as administration, they prohibit us from doing that because there's some sort of insurance issues or whatever. If you're not enrolled in class, you cannot be in a classroom. So if you ask me, I have to say no. Again, not because I care, but because administration tells us to do it. So, and the wait list also has a certain number of spots. If it's too packed, then you won't be able to take class at all. And then people actually do drop it. They drop it right before the deadline, but it may be too late. And because there's this deadline after which you can no longer enroll. And so then I actually end up having, instead of 30 students, 27 students or something, but the other students already can't enroll because we are past the deadline. That's what happens. You have empty spots, but it's too late. Anyway, the last one, having unprotected sex without knowing if you are HIV positive. Now, hopefully that one is rather obvious. Is that a good idea? No, clearly not a good idea. Again, because why? If you use the same approach, if everybody was doing that, would you want it to be universal law? Would you want everybody to behave like this? God, no. I mean, for you personally, you may think, I don't care. Yeah, I'm not sure if I have HIV or not, but so what? But if you care about other people, you really should care. You really should not do that. Because what if somebody else thinks this way and has sex with you without being sure they don't have HIV? Totally different perspective. How it's like suddenly, oh, you SOB, how dare you? How could you do it? But that's why, because you should treat other people the way you want them to treat you. This is essentially the idea here. So this is how he thinks we should approach that question. And again, that human freedom, immortality, and God, note that here he also brings immortality, according to him, are the postulates of morality which we actually need. We need them. We need to look at the world the way that if the world had indeed freedom, we need to kind of accept this possibility of freedom. Similarly, he thinks with immortality. Like again, it's a question, is there life after death? Well, Kant actually thinks that even though we don't know and we will never know, we should behave as if there is. Because it kind of makes sense, according to him. And similarly with God. Again, we will never truly know, at least not in our lifetime, whether there is God or not. But for the purposes of morality, we have to behave as if we know there's God. So, in other words, we should use our reason to follow these rules. Not just because we will be punished by law or something if we don't, but because this is why we have all this freedom and everything. Because we have to behave morally based on reason. Our reason tells us this is the way to go. And Kant is the huge believer in reason. He thinks the reason is really the most important thing we have in this life. Okay, God, I hope that was good enough for Kant. I tried to squeeze him into one lecture, and looks like I've even done it a little bit earlier than the end of class. So now the only thing left is to remind you guys. Again, April 5th, Monday, April 5th, the first day after the spring break, we have our second midterm exam. I will, again, well, it says post the study guide, it's already there, it's from last year or so. You already have the study guide, you know, but 30 questions will come from this 47 questions on the study guide. Some of them will not be there, but at least 30 will be. So make sure that you prepare. Make sure if you don't have answers to some of them, rewatch the videos for relevant philosophers. You will find all the answers there. The recap at the beginning of classes does not cover all of them, but the lecture itself does cover all of them. And again, note that, like I said, let's go back a little bit. I'll show you every time. Yeah, there it is. There is a star that actually says that the question is related to the question on the review, the slide. So reason being source of moral law. If you look at the review, what did the Kant claim could be the basis to derive moral principles? There's your answer. Reason. That's the answer to this last question on the review. Not gonna go through all of them, but you got the idea, right? So just, if you don't have any of them, rewatch the videos and make sure that you understand it. And other than that, everything is the same. So we will, again, have no class on April 5th. You will take that exam. It will be 45 minutes. Same thing exactly as before. And then on April 7th, we will meet and continue, and we will talk about next chapter, the chapter on, John Stuart Mill. And by the way, you should read the John Stuart Mill, which is chapter 11 or something, over the spring break. And there is homework on Kant, which is due this Sunday. I didn't put it here, but just as usual, this is every week we covered Kant. There is chapter on Kant, there is a homework on Kant. And homework on Mill would be at the end of this first week of classes, which is April 11th. Okay, any questions? Thank you very much. This is all we have until April 7th. So good luck on the second exam. Remember, that is very important part of your grade, so take it seriously. And then after that, we'll only have the final left. And with that, I guess we can conclude. Have a great spring break. I will see you April 7th.